just to remind you that we have looked at a range of different landscapes during this series: new town parks, commercial landscapes, landscapes to public housing, and in this section we are looking at public and semi-public parks and gardens. We've already heard about Ian Hamilton Finlay's improvements at Stockwood Park last week, and sorry, not last week, the week before, and last week about Peter Shepherd and his garden on Cheney Walk, a very informative talk. Just to recap, our objective with these talks is to raise awareness about the work, the ideas and thinking of the original designers, and also how these sites are now looking, to see what we can learn from this and take forward, to find out more about the relevant archives and where they are, and of course, what makes these places still so special. And this week, I'm very pleased to welcome Annabel Downs and Annie Thomas, talking about Geoffrey Jellicoe's J.K. Kennedy Memorial at Runnymede. Annabel, as many of you know, trained as a landscape architect, helped create the Landscape Institute archive, for which we are all extremely grateful. The archive, which is now hosted at the Museum of English Rural Life in Reading, and is currently, and I hope for a long time to come, chair of FOLA. Annie Thomas read English at Bristol in the early 1970s. After almost 30 years bringing up a family of 4 and supporting her husband in inner urban Anglican parishes, that excellent training path, which always ensures brilliant future careers, she found herself in paid employment at Goodenough College in a multifaceted role with international students in London, and was subsequently secretary to the Kennedy Memorial Trust from 2007 to 2019. And she has very kindly come out of retirement tonight to co-present this talk. So, Annabel, can we pass over to you to start on this fascinating subject?
Okay. Thank you, Helen, very much. Thank you, Gardens Trust, for the opportunity, and FOLA too. So I think of these 21 parks and gardens that have been added to the Historic England list, Kennedy Memorial will be one of the better known. It's also quite different from the other sites in our series in that this memorial was conceived and designed as a political statement. It served as a performance space for an international political event with the inauguration of the memorial, which was televised and distributed around the world. And it is located within a particular cultural landscape with centuries-old associations as the very birthplace of democracy and human rights, even though there are, even though there are no tangible remains at Runnymede from that signing of Magna Carta to bear witness to this. The plinth and the steps and the path leading to the seats were listed in 1998. But I find it very strange that English Heritage did not then think it necessary to protect the very plot for which this memorial was so intimately and emotionally designed, nor even the woodland path and steps, not until 2020. The Landscape Institute Library and Archive at the Merle holds Susan Jellicoe's fantastic photographic collection, which includes a section on this project, Jellicoe's published work on the memorial, but just 2 photographic copies of Jellicoe's plans on the memorial are in the archive, and these were produced for publication and after the project was completed. One of the exciting things about this project is that it was a national and political initiative, and there are papers and drawings in numerous other archives, all offering a longer time frame and sometimes unexpected stories. So there were 18 months between the assassination of John F. Kennedy in November '63 and the completion and inauguration of this memorial in May 1965, with the Queen and Mrs. Kennedy and many other dignitaries present. There is so much to think and say about this project. However, I'm not an academic, and as well as Jellicoe's own writings, I would direct people to look at Tom Turner's YouTube talk, Geoffrey Jellicoe, Magna Carta Landscape, Kennedy Memorial, Runnymede. But I would like to share some of the information that I have found in my searches. This includes something of the other key people who were involved in the memorial and the decisions made in the first 6 months prior to Jellicoe's appointment. Some of the design drawings that I found, what happened immediately after the inauguration, the attacks, and Jellicoe's long-term involvement with the site. So this is going to be a gallop, so hold on to your horses, please. The question of the memorial began with the Prime Minister, Alec Douglas Hume, who stated that he wanted to consider the most appropriate form of memorial which would best express our people's gratitude. And as Kennedy was cut off in his prime, he was only 46, the Prime Minister didn't feel it was appropriate and didn't anticipate that this would be a statue. He set up the President Kennedy Memorial Committee in December 1963 and invited Lord Franks to chair a select group of 14 people to come up with a recommendation for the memorial. Franks was a former ambassador to the US, a successful negotiator in numerous high-level international matters. The committee was carefully composed to include representatives of Northern Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, former British ambassadors and diplomats at Washington, as well as Franks, people representing industry, banking, trade unions, arts, academics, and the key fundraiser for the memorial, the Lord Mayor of London. There were two very interesting women, the prima ballerina Margot Fontaine and Barbara Ward, the environmental economist and who knew Kennedy. The Prime Minister was concerned that both left and right-wing political views were fairly represented. The committee was supported by two civil servants, Peter Baldwin and Anthony Annand, who prepared in consultation with Lord Franks a draft desiderata to help with selection for a memorial. And they were looking for some imaginative quality to come out of it. They said it should be dignified, not controversial, acceptable to US opinion, of the right scale, not too diminutive as this would be seen as an insult, nor too great as this might prove unachievable and result in a humiliation. It should be something of enduring interest. It should reflect the vitality, altruism, personal interests and achievements of Kennedy. It should not primarily benefit the UK. If it was going to be a continuing activity, this should be something in which the UK excels, so the nation will be giving of its best. There were 150 letters with suggestions covering many topics: new hospitals, universities, Peace Corps, renaming ships, and in amongst them was a plot of land set aside as a world territory and the idea of a living memorial. The committee were encouraged to use the public suggestions as a guide for what the public would want and be prepared to support. The 14 agreed early on that there should be some physical monument, but that it should be a minor element within the memorial. By the end of their considerations, it was agreed that of the two components to the memorial, a Kennedy acre of Runnymede was to be the primary element. They all agreed on this. And as the supporting element, either scholarships to Harvard, MIT, and Radcliffe College for women, or an SOS relief of suffering in the event of a sudden disaster or emergency overseas, or support cultural training of overseas volunteers. So here is an OS map of Runnymede. And then if you can see my little diddly-do, that's the Thames. Oh God, sorry. And this is Runnymede itself, the meadow, and then there's the sort of the higher ground at the back of it. And Windsor Great Park is over here, and Egham is here, Staines is here, and Heathrow is about 4 or 6 miles up north. Sorry, just lost my spot in a moment. It's not clear who on the committee suggested Runnymede. It wasn't proposed in the meeting, but it was recorded that in a phone call with Vic Feather, he agreed that an acre of Runnymede was a good suggestion. Franks checked the 4 ideas out in person with the Queen. He went to the States to meet Mrs. Kennedy, JFK's brother, deans at Harvard and MIT, and then the Prime Minister before the committee made their final decision. Mrs. Kennedy wrote to Franks afterwards I was so touched at your concern, she said, and all the effort and care with which you are giving to a memorial to President Kennedy, and that Great Britain should care so much. And the Queen had shown deep and direct interest in the memorial and had been pleased with the proposal for the Kennedy acre, and also that Mrs. Kennedy had been deeply moved by the proposal that there should be an acre of Runnymede dedicated to her husband's memory. Others he had consulted in the US regarded it as a generous and imaginative tribute. The final report of the President Kennedy Memorial Committee to the Prime Minister in February '64 stated, President Kennedy gave a voice to the heritage which is enshrined for us in Runnymede. We propose that an acre of Runnymede, laid out simply with a simple plinth and steps, should be given in perpetuity to the US in memory of him. This would be at the center of our memorial, but it would not be the whole memorial. So this became the brief for an as yet undetermined site. Plus, for the living memorial, the committee agreed to support the Kennedy scholarships for students to go to Harvard, MIT, and Radcliffe. Both of these elements form the Kennedy Memorial. Almost every government department with people at very senior level were involved with the memorial. People from the Treasury, Cabinet Office, Foreign Office, Home Office, Prime Minister's Office, Ministry of Housing and Local Government, Public Buildings and Works, Crown Estate, Air Ministry, Ministry of Defence, Department of Education and Science, also the leader of the opposition, who was then Harold Wilson, and leader of the Liberal Party, Joe Grimmett. There were other organisations outside government too that were involved. The Lord Mayor of London, the Governor of the Bank of England, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, Charity Commission, Lord Harlech, who was then the current ambassador to Washington, and the US ambassador to the Court of St. James. Also, Master of the Rolls, the chair of the Magna Carta Trust, and chairman and staff of the National Trust. So these are some photos taken a few years ago to give an idea of the scale and feel of Runnymede and the slopes behind forming a backcloth to the meadow. So this is looking west. Oh, sorry, that was looking east. Sorry, I beg your pardon. And this is looking west. So the question was, where in Runnymede? The area coloured lilac is 182.5 acres of land gifted to the National Trust in about 1929 by a wealthy American local resident, Cara Broughton, in memory of her recently deceased husband. She did this because a few years earlier, the government put up for auction Crown land on Runnymede to help pay off the war debt. This included the site where the King's armies and the barons camped before the signing of Magna Carta. This land was almost lost only 100 years ago, so we have come some way since then with regard to valuing our heritage. But I think this shows we must never stop being vigilant and protesting as necessary. Notice of the proposed sale was spotted by a lady barrister, the local vicar, and a member of the House of Lords who campaigned vigorously at the prospect of this sacred land being developed. They ended up forming a Magna Carta Society and held annual pageants to celebrate the history of the site. The American widow, by this time Lady Fairhaven, had commissioned Lutyens to design and build the 2 memorial lodges, a pair of kiosks, and the 2 piers at each end of the mead on this land in memory of her husband. And then in July 1963, Egham Urban District Council, London County Council had land there, and other holders of land on Cooper's Hill and Priest's Hill donated the second block of land to the National Trust, almost doubling its holding. Preliminary investigations were carried out by the Treasury to check out that a site at Runnymede was feasible. They held confidential talks with the National Trust Secretary and Regional Secretary, who were very clear that nothing could happen on National Trust land. This was reported to the Franks Committee, but was not regarded as an insurmountable problem by the civil servants. The Franks Committee was to recommend the ideas. It was for the government to overcome any obstacles in obtaining the land. And the government must see that the nation does the worthy thing in memory of President Kennedy. The Franks Committee recommendations of both forms of memorial was formally accepted by the Prime Minister's statement to the House of Commons in March '64, 2 days before the Easter break. still without a specific site selected. The news was now public, an acre of Runnymede and Kennedy scholarships, and there had been no leaks. Although the broadsheets were enthusiastic, there was opposition. Everyone, and there were many who'd advised the Prime Minister about the acre of Runnymede, had strongly recommended consultation with the National Trust chairman, David Lindsay, Lord Crawford, before making any public announcement. Discussions with Crawford was finally arranged at 12:15 with a phone call on the day of the announcement. It was arranged by the Prime Minister's private secretary, but there is no evidence of a conversation having happened in the Prime Minister's files at the National Archive. Crawford was livid. National Trust land was inalienable. The National Trust has unique statutory power to declare land inalienable, which means that it can't be sold, mortgaged, or compulsorily purchased against their wishes without special parliamentary procedure. And he was undoubtedly even more angry when he discovered that the National Trust Secretary and the regional agent had been placed in an invidious position of having had discussions with the government beforehand and sworn to secrecy. My communications with the National Trust on Runnymede, not in the National Trust files at the time, disclosed that the 1931 gifted meadowland was declared inalienable in November 1940, and land at Cooper's Hill was not declared inalienable until January 65, so it was vulnerable. There was other discontent too. The man from the Treasury had also observed to the Franks Committee that clearly there is some risk that the Runnymede area is being turned into a kind of cemetery on a vast scale. And on this map, we see the Fairhaven memorials in green at either end of the mead. The American Bar Association, the Magna Carta Trust memorial built in the 1950s, and the Commonwealth War Graves Air Forces Memorial cut out on the skyline. The letter in the newspaper from the local historian B.F.J. Pardo was against spattering more masonry across Runnymede, plinths and steps admirably suited for Grosvenor and Parliament Squares, the site of the three other US president statues at the time, are totally unsuited to that historic and still near rural stretch of river meadows at Runnymede. That the National Trust, he said, should acquiesce in any additional urbanization of a public open space of which it is custodian would be tantamount to a breach of trust. In the National Trust files too, the eminent Oxford scholar and historian Howard Colvin thought Runnymede would be better without the American Bar Association's temple, but that at least commemorates an event connected with the place. No such justification can be claimed for a memorial to an American president. He too hoped that the National Trust would consider its duty to resist any further proposals in this matter. And Sir Anthony Wagner, Garter Principal, King of Arms, considered the proposed use of National Trust land would be deplorable, but still more deplorable in the precedent it would set. So he trusted that it will be resisted to the last ditch. Some wrote in opposition to President Kennedy for being a warmonger and being celebrated in such a hallowed place. At Egham Urban District Council, where outline approval was soon to be recommended by the Planning Committee, but not yet the councillors aired their views in the evening news, and undoubtedly with the Magna Carta memorial in mind, they wrote directly to the Lord Mayor of London that they were opposed to any suggestion that the land should be landscaped with reference to the appointment of a landscape consultant. They opposed the erection of a stone plinth on or about the 100-foot contour line, and they were also opposed to the approach steps from the meads. They wanted the land opened up to the public and left very much in its present state, since it forms an important piece of backcloth to the meads. They wanted it to look inconspicuous with access to the site by way of a stile. A number of these quite fierce protests, and particularly the National Trust and the Egham councillors, directly and indirectly shaped the site and the final design. Others demonstrated their opposition to the idea simply by not supporting the Lord Mayor's appeal after its launch. And this is the American Bar Association site. Sir Roger Makins, who had been on the Franks Committee, was appointed to chair the new Kennedy Memorial Committee, a new committee of just 3 men. So him, David Bruce, the US ambassador to the UK, and Humphrey Myners, recently retired Deputy Governor of the Bank of England. Makins knew how government worked. He listened closely, he was decisive, had high expectations, and was very fast working. Within 4 months, this committee achieved what it was tasked to do: to find a site, to arrange acquisition of the land, to determine if an Act of Parliament was required, and if so, set up the bill and get it enacted, to appoint the designer, to set up the Kennedy Memorial Trust and the trustees who would maintain the land on behalf of the people of the US, move on scholarships, and a whole lot of other things. So where in Runnymede? So William Lovett from the Ministry of Housing and Local Government made several visits to Runnymede. He also accompanied Makins, and he quickly won Makins' respect. He was an architect and planner. He'd worked on and written up reports on metropolitan open space and the Greenbelt. He was a man of huge sensitivity, vision, and imagination, and practical too. He played a significant role in guiding and training Makins and his committee, who would never have dealt with anything quite like this project before, probably. In his report for this committee, Lovett wrote, "Where on this site can an acre be dedicated as a memorial site? I'm sure the answer lies in the treatment that the hillside should in any case receive, to which this memorial would be a quiet, emotional enrichment. The hillside restoration needs several years' work, but there is no reason why one part of it should not be completed at once, with foot approaches, keeping in mind a plan for the remainder. To create an open clearing through glades and woodland containing a memorial is both of great antiquity and very much part of the English landscape tradition. Gods and goddesses, great men and vain men, and much loved pets have all been so commemorated, sometimes conspicuously with obelisks and columns, sometimes ornately with temples, urns, and statues, and sometimes modestly with a flat slab or plinth block." He added, "Whoever is appointed should at least ideally have some say in the choice of site, even if he is led gently to the one described." He suggested a few men of proven talent as both architects and landscape architects: Frederick Gibbard, Peter Shepherd. Basil Spence also, who would need to work with a landscape architect. He named Sylvia Crow and Peter Youngman as landscape architects to work in association with an architect. On one of the copies of this report, Jellicoe's name was added in the margin in pencil. Lovett proposed the first 2 one-acre sites. Makins rejected one of these, and Lovett returned with 2 more. There were 6 sites in total examined as possible Kennedy acres. The last 2, 5 and 6, there's 5 and this is 6, were outside of National Trust land, were proposed by the National Trust Secretary and Regional Agent in what began as an uncomfortable meeting of distrust. The area in yellow is outlined by the Crown Estate. They had already been consulted about their land in the area, and apart from Windsor Great Park, had suggested Winfield House, the American ambassador's residence in London, or Plymouth Hoe as suitable sites. The Crown Estate was not legally allowed to gift any of its lands, not even as a gift from the Queen. They seem to have overlooked the fact that they owned a chunk of land let out to a dog breeder and kennel owner, which is now a branch of Battersea Dogs Home, with a major part subtenanted to a cattle farmer. Lovett was able to envisage different designs for each site, including the strip of land at Runnymede House at Site 5, with the advantage that this would easily be accessible, be actually on Runnymede, none of the other sites proposed were, and would be safer from vandalism, being closer to the memorial lodges, one of which was the National Trust's home for their warden. Makins and everyone else agreed Site 6, this one, which was part of the Crown Estate and on the land rising above Runnymede, was the most favourable. It avoided further conflict with the National Trust, and so this was the site selected. So this is the meadow, the Thames is up here. And it sits on the edge of the meadow and aligns with the public footpath, which runs up here. On the other side of the footpath in this little finger of woodland is the American Bar Association Magna Carta Memorial. There were protracted negotiations with the Crown Estate as the landlord and their tenant and subtenant, fencing to keep cattle and kennel dogs in and people out, etc. Both tenant and subtenant agreed to give up an acre or 3 acres of land in principle, but in practice the Crown Estate who were to deal with this aspect were not very efficient. It wasn't clear or known even from the outset who would be managing the project. It had been thought Ministry of Public Building and Works would, but Makins kept his hand on the tiller. He had within the last month or so stepped down as chair of the Atomic Energy Authority and was fully engaged with this project. So Sir Robert Matthew, RIBA president, and Leslie Milner White, president of the Institute of Landscape Architects, were consulted for recommendations for architects or landscape architects suitable for this project. The RIBA named Geoffrey Jellicoe, Frederick Gibbard, and Peter Shepherd. The ILA offered only one name, Geoffrey Jellicoe, but suggested there could be a competition. Lovett commented that while Jellicoe would doubtless give a sound job, was well qualified and a member of the Royal Fine Art Commission, who would need to be consulted on this project, Shepherd might be more sensitive. The recommendation was enough for Makins. He and Miners and a representative for the US ambassador arranged to meet Jellicoe at Runnymede on a Saturday morning on the 2nd of May. And following this meeting, Makins wrote to Lovett saying that Jellicoe was enthusiastic about the site we chose and is not only willing but anxious to do the work. His first thoughts are very much in line with yours and mine. Jellicoe was very pleased also, and it didn't seem to worry Makins that at the end of the coming week, Jellicoe was going to Japan for an IFLA conference and wouldn't be available until June. Jellicoe was 63 years old. He was an architect, town planner, landscape architect, and although he'd never used the term landscape architect or town planner on his letterhead, through IFLA, the International Federation of Landscape Architects, and the Institute of Landscape Architects, both of which he was involved in founding, he was possibly the best known landscape architect in the UK, if not internationally. The range of work he'd been involved with was huge, including plans for existing towns and new towns, memorial gardens, landscape and conservation plans for mineral extraction, landscape plans for hospitals, shop roof gardens, power stations, high energy laboratories for the Atomic Energy Authority, landscapes for commercial businesses, nationalized industries, church authorities, civic centers. He seemed to embrace everything. From very early on in his career, any division or distinction between planning, architecture and landscape was seamless. Also, he'd been writing and getting his books published from the very beginning of his career. He'd written 5 books on garden design before the war and had recently published volume 1 of his 3-volume studies in landscape design. He used writing to inform his design and his design work to inform his writing. Talking, and especially with students about his work, further informed his writing and thinking. Jellicoe had been striving to do more than just good design. And at the ICA in 1961, he said, "We have in this country at last reached a point where seamliness as an objective in landscape design is no longer enough. We can and should make landscape as meaningful as painting." And this is already evident in his writing about Harwell and Hemel Water Gardens. Jellicoe was given Frank's brief, a marked up OS copy map of the site, some of Lovett's information. He was sent the Egham Urban District Council's demands, and at this time, or when he returned from Japan, he would have had a copy probably of the appeal leaflet. This is such an unusual image used to portray President Kennedy. It's a cropped photo by Mark Shaw taken in 1959 on dunes at Hyannis Port, Cape Cod, apparently a favourite photo of JFK. It is without pomp. You can't even see his face, which makes it quite private and not at all presidential. Jellicoe refers to the photo adopted in England as a symbol of his personality, showing him striding through a natural landscape. I don't know who asked for the photo or who chose it. It will have been done in association with Mrs. Kennedy. Thinking about this further, the photo was possibly selected after the Franks report and the acre of Runnymede had been announced. So Jellicoe's designs. There were 4 iterations of design, generally with only very minor modifications. The first drawing, dated the 15th of June 1964, is missing. It was presented to Makins and Miners at the Cabinet Office, and the minutes say, "From the existing right-of-way, which ran along the southern side of the site, a set of steps would lead to a simple stone plinth, which would be suitably inscribed." This is Frank's brief, completed in a sentence. Then it continues, "Running at approximately right angles from the plinth would be a path of Portland stone about 170 foot long. The path would end at a clump of trees at the present northern border of the site and would lead to 2 simple stone terraces on which there would be 2 stone benches. The pathway would follow the natural lie of the land, and the fences on either side would be concealed in the fall of the land. If these proposals were approved, no boundaries would be visible from the path." It is a straightforward, minimal account, and it's hard to imagine that Jellicoe would have delivered it in quite this way or explained so little about his concept. No one challenged his extension of the brief. He was leading people away from the memorial stone to seats and to consider the view across Runnymede meadow. There were no gardens, no roses, no seats looking at the memorial. Jellicoe wanted the site to remain untouched in appearance, farmland bordering a woodland with hidden boundaries. Issues were raised about fencing, but nothing about the design. Makins approved the idea, but told Jellicoe afterwards he thought 1 platform would do instead of 2. Jellicoe said that this was his original idea and he didn't disagree, but he kept to the 2 seats. At the second meeting, 2 plans were presented on the 23rd of June. So the first drawing focuses on the plinth. The plinth is this darker line here, and then these are the steps, and many steps up to the plinth. The stone path across the terrace, and the seats, and how this is all tied together in the existing vegetation, much as was described in the first meeting minutes. No site boundary or footpath is shown on this drawing. The accompanying drawing shows the whole site and an irregular boundary that he's chosen, just as a section of the site of the OS map marked up in green. The site boundary is shown, but not the footpath. The plinth and the steps are shown where they're shown where the footpath would be if this were marked up. And the footpath was a public right-of-way under Egham's control. And if the footpath was blocked by a fence or the memorial, there would need to be a hybrid bill, and there was no time for that. One of the Crown Estate Commissioners observed to his senior officer, "It was part of his Jellicoe's thinking that the sense of detachment and the wildness of the scenery should be preserved. And so that this quality was not destroyed, it was important that no railings around the memorial site should be visible from the site itself." The National Trust, who had also attended the meeting, wrote to Crawford that they were so pleased that it wasn't another town hall being constructed on the slopes. Relations with them were improved, and they were invited to maintain the site after it was completed, which they did. The third drawing on the 25th of June simply shows the outline of the site boundary for the transfer of land, and this does include the footpath. 1 Kennedy acre equals 3.431 acres. But Jellicoe was still working on the design, and this is not the final area of land used for the memorial, as the footpath was relocated through the woods. This outline of the site was transferred to an OS map to accompany the John F. Kennedy Memorial Act, which is shown here. The Act received royal assent on the 31st of July 1964, the last day of Parliament. Initially, this was possibly to add a bit of theatre, but very soon it was seen as essential. This was the first time in the UK that land had been gifted in perpetuity to another country, and Crown land was not allowed to be gifted except by statute. So the Act transfers and vests in the USA the freehold of the site. It transfers to the trustees an interest in the site, meaning its control and management in perpetuity. The land is inalienable after it's been vested and cannot be transferred to a third party except by statute. It gives the trustees all such rights and powers as if they were owners of any estate vested in the US, that is to manage and maintain the site as a place to which public would have access, and gives them the power to determine the times and conditions of public access. In this way, UK sovereignty over the land was not lost and the site remained subject to English law. It was accessible to the public, so the Kennedy Memorial is a charitable activity. With all the fanfare, no one thought to deposit a copy of the Kennedy Act or this plan of the site with the US government. Makin's committee completed all the tasks, and the Kennedy Memorial Trust was established with 9 trustees, 3 from America and 6 from the UK. It was clear that Makins did not wish to chair the next stage, and he suggested Lord Harlech should take this on. He was still the UK ambassador in the US. Makins was a trustee and was closely involved with the inauguration and the site works. Jellicoe presented his proposals to the trustees at their first committee meeting on the 24th of July. This was a bit of a formality as it had already been approved, but it's worth noting at this time that the scheme still begins at the steps by the plinth. The minutes state, Mr. Jellicoe intended that the first part of the memorial would be emotionally evocative, and that the walk and the terrace would serve to give the public the opportunity to reflect upon the life and work of the late president, and would thus be intellectually stimulating. The square shapes, which were the essence of the design, were the symbol and theme of civilization. Jellicoe requested an extra sum for a model to be made to show and convince the councillors at Egham and the Royal Fine Art Commission that the scheme met their demands. Although this turned out to be more costly than he estimated, Jellicoe requested the model makers show the trees more accurately and possibly also the levels. He justified its importance to Makins by saying, it can be said with absolute truth that the model has been invaluable in helping shape the land on the site. The steps and proportions of treads for the plinths and the seats as constructed match exactly those shown on the model. Susan Jellicoe's slides show a number of other models made for projects, and the model seems to be a significant design tool, and perhaps there were preliminary office models made to reach this stage. The final drawing was produced in September for the planning committees at Egham and Surrey Planners and the Royal Fine Art Commission, of which Jellicoe was a member. So this shows the new wiggly footpath through the wood, but no indication of the steps. The junction of the path with the plinth and the approach steps. More of the existing trees are shown. The ha-ha and the fence line and a deep wide cutting, rather like a stitched scar. And contour lines were added, but no heights were given. And this is it in a bit more detail. Everyone was happy and it was all approved and there were no more hurdles. The contractor was appointed. William Wood had been asked to price for this project, but had quoted a bonkers figure. I couldn't find out what it was. James Carmichael of Wandsworth was appointed as the main contractor. Jellicoe quoted £25,000 for the whole project, covering the contractor's work, Portland stone and his own fees, plus the opening ceremony costs. Lovett had estimated a memorial would cost between £25,000 and £50,000. Makins asked Jellicoe several times to confirm the price, which he did. Work started on site in October '64. So Makins asked Jellicoe about the inscription, and it doesn't seem that Jellicoe forwarded any suggestions about this, except he knew the size of the stone he wanted, 10 foot wide, 5 foot height, and 2 foot deep. But Makins chose and decided all the words and confirmed this with his committee, or actually with the trustees. So Alan Collins was the sculptor and the stone carver who designed the lettering and the arrangement on the stone, and he was appointed in October '64. There was much backwards and forwards on this between Makins, Jellicoe, and Collins. Makins was meticulous about the Kennedy quote, especially the punctuation. Jellicoe was much less interested in this. But Jellicoe did notice early on there was no reference that Kennedy was a president. Someone else spotted the birth date was wrong, as is evident on this drawing here. A draft was published in the newspaper, and a reader spotted that the presidency didn't start till 1961. This was forwarded to the committee and not published in the letters page. And I love this photo. Fancy having your family meals with this as the background. It looks like the wall of the Collins household is covered in pegboard just for this purpose. There is no punctuation on the finished stone in the president's quote from the inaugural address, and Collins subtly spaced the words to indicate the pauses, and you can see that in his pencil work here. The carving was done during February and March 1965, with Philip Murdin cutting the initial letters and Alan Collins finishing off in his style. Interestingly, Collins was left-handed. They worked in a shed to keep the stone dry and away from prying eyes and the press, and the stone was later craned onto its foundations and bronze pins. Both Alan Collins and Philip Murdin had worked together on letter cutting for Jellicoe and Coleridge at Plymouth Civic Centre. Apart from this drawing for the entrance to the woodland path and a seat design not approved by the National Trust, there are no other detailed drawings survive of the woodland path and the steps. And I presume the stone firms would have produced their own shop drawings for all the stonework, the steps to the plinth, the two seats, and the stones for the path in between. Susan Jellicoe's photos show the site during and after completion. Jellicoe produced a press statement about this design to mark the first anniversary after the assassination on the 22nd of November. This was just after the start of work on site and before the new woodland path. So he describes three elements of the design: the Portland Memorial stone on a granite plinth, the paved walk leading along the contours to the main view, the two symbolic seats for contemplation between thorn trees crowned by the pine, and the second, less formal, partly concealed by vegetation. The intention, he said, was to create a frame of mind in the visitor in which the significance of the superb view is brought home. The inscribed stone is only the beginning of a process of thought and intuition. In a programme note drafted for the inauguration and written the following February 1965, but not used, Jellicoe explored ideas with Makins, each making changes to the text. So Jellicoe wrote to Makins, "I have found this extraordinarily difficult to write, for it really wants someone like Lawrence Binyon." Binyon was an art scholar at the British Museum and a war poet. He said there is double meaning all the way through, and one has to avoid God-watery. There are three elements he identifies, which were now the woodland path, the inscribed stone, and the terrace and the two seats overlooking Runnymede. These are visited, he said, in progression, interpreted as being symbolic of life, death, and the spirit. The gate probably hasn't yet been added. The sets are not identified as pilgrims. The two seats are for solitary contemplation, symbolic of a public and private image of the president, but the seed of double meaning is sown. Later on in 1967, Jellicoe gave a lecture to Royal Academy students, subsequently included in volume 3 of his studies in landscape design, which was published in 1970. I'm going to quote from this to accompany Susan's photos. So the development of Jellicoe's thinking about this design needs to be the subject of another talk. It's very complicated. So he wrote then, "The JFK Memorial is an allegory in landscape to appeal to the mind rather than the eye. It is an allegory of life, death, and the spirit." He said the essential visual monument is the acre of primitive meadowland, and that whatever was required to announce and describe the monument was secondary. In short, the landscape and not a physical monument within it was to be the memorial. This is something that both he and Makins arrived at through their exchange of descriptions and analysis of the site. He recognized three principal requirements. The character of the whole must be in harmony with the character of the man, in harmony with the genius loci, which in Runnymede is powerful in its own right, and the design must be practical to use and maintain. The conventional classical memorial was no longer thought appropriate and was replaced, as in all the arts, by the desire to establish an idea that is indestructible and therefore immortal. So here is the start of the journey. The style that Egham councillors wanted to see became for Jellicoe a kissing gate that he named and has been referred to ever since as the Wicket Gate. This is echoing one of that forms the entrance gate in John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress that was so problematic to reach and marks the threshold to Christianity and eternal life. Jellicoe says the sets represent the multitude for whom Kennedy stood as champion for individual freedom. The craftsman, he said, had difficulty achieving his request to have them laid randomly until Jellicoe suggested that he should imagine that they were a crowd attending a football match and that the steps be like the front of such a crowd. The wood is symbolic of the virility and mystery of nature as a life force. Apart from a few repairs and encouragement to the ground cover, he regarded this as a natural ecosystem, self-regenerating, one to be left largely undisturbed. It was important that the view from the woodland path did not reveal any open land until the stone was reached. This is to encourage the sense of foreboding that woods that close in upon one can evoke, reminding us of the dark wood of Dante. A few hundred rhododendron ponticum were added to the wood and later removed by the National Trust as weeds, and some ground cover natives, but no planting plans or schedules have survived, except we know from correspondence that Susan Jellicoe oversaw this part of the works. For the first-time visitor, there is no hint of what is to come. And this is the jostling front edge of the steps. The stone is symbolic of a catafalque, he says. A catafalque is something that supports a coffin, borne on the shoulders of the multitude. His intention was to give an effect of a great weight floating just above the ground. Because the lettering covers the entire face of the stone, he said this appears not so much as an inscription upon it as an expression of the stone itself. It is as if it were the stone speaking. The shallow steps in front of the stone emerged from the sets of the path with a neat twist. The symbolism of the thorn trees now becomes apparent, for the president was a Catholic. Behind the stone is an American oak, which in time, Jellicoe observes, will provide shade and a sense of protection. From now onwards, we are concerned with the visible expression of what may be described as the aspiration of the human spirit. The path to the seats is direct, he said, like Jacob's ladder. The upper seat is the public image of the president. The secondary seat to the left, which is just tucked in down here, or here, of the photos, is that of his consort. It fits the nature of the existing levels and is tucked away privately among the rampant hedges and adjoining molehills. These photos also show the important long view across the historic meadow, the Thames and beyond for many miles north, which must surely also be made a protected view. Jellicoe says the first sketches were made during his visit to Japan for the IFLA conference and where they visited a number of historic and modern gardens. He writes in Studies in Landscape that Japan is the only civilization in history to have created a fully developed allegorical landscape. The 15th century Zen Buddhist gardens represent in essence the progress of the soul through the world until it comes to rest in the sand gardens of contemplation. The Zen garden, he said, is a landscape of symbols in progression. He added an allegory, even if it is known to exist, usually remains something of an enigma. He said it wasn't wise, or rather aesthetic suicide, to reveal the meaning behind the design. So the inauguration was held on the 14th of May, 1965, in full sunshine. It lasted about half an hour. It was entirely successful. It was televised and filmed and broadcast around the world. The seating arrangement of the Kennedy and the royal family and the VVIPs was organized, so they were up here, were organized to give the cameras the best angles rather than the viewing public in the meadows below. And if visitor numbers are a measure of success, between May and October, the first 5 months, it was estimated that 250,000 people came to see the memorial. This was not anticipated by anyone. It was not designed for this volume of people. The site was almost trashed. The weather was wet during the summer and the autumn in that first year. It's on a clay soil. There are lots of complaints and soon adverse press coverage. Some visitors didn't understand that understated design does not signify a lack of respect. They wanted to see more of the things they expected. Flowers, the plinth and memorial stone fenced off and protected, more pomp, more ceremony, more landscaping. They wanted to buy booklets and postcards to take away, and there was nothing like this. And then there was more mud. People jumped over the wicket gate to get in, or balanced across rugby posts laid in the ground. There were repeated press reports of vandalism to the stone. This was immediately dealt with. Also litter. Jellicoe resisted litter bins. The Kennedy brothers, US senators and diplomats all received complaints. Problems were compounded with the National Trust car parks being shut in October, as they always had been, so there was nowhere to park locally until Easter the following year. The police were already concerned with numbers of people crossing the road, by then a clearway, and with the National Trust car parks on opposite side of the road, had been dealing with, were dealing with illegal parking along the road when the car parks were shut from autumn to spring. Coachloads of people were booking to come to visit the memorial. On a positive note, the National Trust were benefiting from considerably improved car parking revenues and ice cream sales. Jellicoe and the site were under some pressure, but he exercised a moderating hand, stood his ground with the trustees and others, and above all, he was optimistic, positive and practical in how he dealt with this. He reviewed the site in October and prepared a written report. He advised against any major works which might later prove abortive or that would disrupt the site for long periods. Above all, Jellicoe sought to avoid any urbanizing of the design, since this might well prove disastrous to the original landscape concept. This should remain, he said, primarily for serious and quiet contemplation, a place of pilgrimage, able to take a reasonable number of persons at any one time, and essentially a rural rather than an urban experience. If it was an urban project, he said, the path up to the memorial would be 8-foot wide continuous path in tarmac, and we've all seen plenty of these. The environment of the memorial stone is the one area which must be kept as reasonably immaculate as possible, since upon this depends the sensitivity of the whole project. But he said at present, this project is like a painting that has fallen on the floor and has been walked upon. He acknowledged his error of judgment about where people would walk and take photos at the plinth, and he agreed to extend the sets around the stone. And you can see on this, on the right-hand side of the memorial stone, in this photo where he's extended it. The National Trust refused to allow more sets in the mead, and the ditch and the drain wasn't being cleared, so the entrance remained a problem, but it was also difficult to improve drainage in a flood meadow. The subtenant farmer was unhappy about the steepness of the ha-ha bank with his cattle and how he could maintain this. And then there was a landslip along part of the sunken fence. There was paint daubing and names scratched on the stone. None of these issues were easily resolved. Kennedy was a good newspaper story. Jellicoe rightly argued that visitor numbers would fall, which they eventually did. A few years later, the main path was widened. But all of these issues paled to insignificance when 3 years after the inauguration, on the night of the 26th of October 1968, there was an explosion heard in Egham and Old Windsor and Windsor, which cracked horizontally and split vertically the stone with a crater blasted out the back. Jellicoe heard the news and rushed down to Runnymede the following morning. The stone firms had made available another piece the same size as a replacement. Jellicoe was involved in seeing the repair a possibility. He sought the advice of the stone firms, who were not overly optimistic, and he managed the trustees' expectations. The repair would not achieve perfection, as that would be impossible, but it would be a controlled repair that incorporated the damage in an aesthetically acceptable form, and that is what happened. 6 years later, the second major attack on July 74, when the stone was winched off its pins and toppled, it was dropped onto the wicket gate which had been placed on the steps. The most serious damage was done to the top 2 steps, which were destroyed. the original arrangement, which you can see here on the left-hand side, of the 3 stones. Jellicoe agreed to reduce costs to replace these with 3 and then 4 stones. No one except Lovett imagined the monument would be subject to attacks, but as we've seen recently, witnessed, lots of monuments are vandalized. Jellicoe stayed on hand for 20 years, till he was 85 years old. He was still actively working, doing some of his most accomplished and successful designs. And then he handed over to Valerie and John Winter to cope with a major repair of the steps for the granite set path going up through the woodland. This site is protected in perpetuity. How many landscape designs are given that privilege or protection? The visitor numbers are far more manageable now. The National Trust don't count visitors, so we don't know how many visit, but they come in small groups and large, and sometimes with their dogs. In Jellicoe's 20 years, the biggest ongoing issue was maintenance and management of the site. He said the intention is to convey the same impression as that of a Greek temple, whose presence lends meaning to a primitive scene. There was to be no neatly cut grass, and Jellicoe acknowledges that technically the maintenance of the status quo of the existing landscape proved probably the most difficult of all. Much is known, he said, about the creation of a normal park or garden, but little as yet about the recreation of natural scenery in such a way that it survives the human element. The stone was to be kept in pristine condition, which it isn't looking so clean and white in these photos, but significantly it now records its own history as well as that of Kennedy's. The woodland path has been repaired several times. There have been some replacement tree planting. There's a lot of ash in the wood, and the American oak wasn't looking so happy a few years ago. There are ongoing difficulties with the National Trust to improve drainage at the entrance. And no one corresponds by letters anymore, and the source of information through the archives has greatly diminished. What Jellicoe was doing with some of his talks and texts on this project was the equivalent of the audio guides we have now at exhibitions. He was so forward-thinking. But not so many non-landscape architects have access to this. This notice board has been placed by the wicket gate to explain Jellicoe's ideas. And as we've already heard, famously, he said it was aesthetic suicide to explain and expose an idea that may lie invisible behind a work of art. But I think this sign, although it's really quite ugly and out of character with Jellicoe, I do think that if you don't share some of his thoughts and ideas with visitors, because we all have different experiences and come from different backgrounds, a good number of us would never be within reach of some of his ideas. So this is a very special place, very beautiful for being understated and modest in design. And it's now coming up to 60 years since it was completed. And a lot of Americans don't know it exists. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Annabel. That's stunning. When I've recovered my voice, I think we'll pass fairly rapidly on to you, Annie, if we may, and then I'm hoping we will have time for 1 or 2 questions at the end. I don't want to put pressure on you, Annie, but it would be nice to be able to respond to 1 or 2 of the questions. Annabel, thank you very much indeed.
Absolutely. So I just want to say at the get-go, despite my appearing as the Kennedy Memorial Trust at the base of my video, I retired from the Trust 2 years ago, and what follows is very much a personal reflection. Please don't take it as some sort of official pronouncement from the Kennedy Memorial Trust, because it isn't. So from the very early stages of the establishing of the Kennedy Memorial in both its facets, administration was done by one person. Initially, because of the appeal, it was done via the Lord Mayor of London's office, and then it was handed over firstly to the Association of Commonwealth Universities, and then from the mid-1980s, a secretary was appointed by the trustees of the Kennedy Memorial Trust. And she, and it always has been a woman from that time, was then answerable to the trustees. That I was only number 3 of those people on my appointment in 2007 says something about continuity of relationship and oversight. I retired just as lockdown struck in March 2020. And perhaps I should also make it clear at this point that all the trustees of the Kennedy Memorial Trust give their time voluntarily. The secretary, now my successor, now called the director, is the only salaried position. So both financially and in terms of time taken, the scholarship competition, which is run UK-wide every year, is the major consumer. As regards Runnymede, the Kennedy Trust pays the National Trust an annual management fee, and there is an agreement regarding what that covers. My practice was to report at some length to the trustees once a year and to a particular trustee as issues arose. And I would make at least 2 scheduled and lengthy visits to the memorial, often accompanied by a trustee each year. One visit tended to be in May and the other in early October. I mean, to be honest, those were largely times when the scholarship schedule permitted me to visit, but they were also, I think, in terms of the kind of natural cycle, they were quite good times to be at the memorial and get a feel for what was happening. My main contact throughout this relationship was the site warden, who was appointed by the National Trust. In my time, I got to work with 3 of them, and I really appreciated those relationships. When I was visiting the site, we'd review, walk through the site together, review the appearance, consider any health and safety issues, plant management concerns, minor works that might be manageable between ourselves, and bigger projects that need to be agreed by the Kennedy trustees and overseen by National Trust approved contractors. In between those visits, email was the key medium, unless the regular patrols by the warden uncovered something which warranted a phone call. As an example of kind of minor works, which the National Trust and I managed between us, damaged areas of the pathway up through the wood needed regular repairing. And we had a wonderful guy called Angus Turner, who was known to the National Trust and was a sensitive and creative relayer of sets to fill the holes and make the path safer. He was also very good at seeing the line of the path, because you'll appreciate that over time, tree roots and the general level of growth around the footpath created quite distorted sort of holes and trip hazards. And, it was problematic. Angus had a good eye, and that was great. And I worked with him over at least 2 fallow periods in his work as a local gardener. As an example of a bigger project, Clifton Conservation, who were the National Trust's preferred partner in major stonework throughout my and my predecessor's tenure, and maybe ongoing, I just don't know, made considerable repairs to frost-damaged paving stones in Jacob's Ladder, and also lifted and relayed 2 large stones which had shifted, turning over the more heavily damaged adjacent stones at the same time. Both these projects were agreed by the Kennedy trustees and overseen by the warden at the time. I was kept informed, but I wasn't on site in any supervisory capacity. Inevitably, the particular interest and skill set of each warden varied, and they were my passport to what the National Trust would and wouldn't offer. And I was also theirs regarding what additional costs the Kennedy trustees might or might not be willing to meet. This wasn't a working environment in which to get major decisions made quickly, but to be fair, it also wasn't one where that kind of swift response was regularly needed. It was also a working environment significantly dependent upon personality, my own and that of the warden. In my early years, I learned a lot about managing trees, since that reflected the interest and particular knowledge of the then warden. By that time, we were seeking to manage mature trees which were close to the stepped pathway, issues of safety, and also of the sculpted beauty of those trees were key. A number of them had died, and there were questions around, preserving a magnificent tree trunk as against the risk to members of the public. The Kennedy Trustees paid for significant tree surgery. I was regularly told that there was no money for more than the occasional hay cut of the meadow alongside Jacob's ladder to the seats of contemplation. This necessitated bringing in a small tractor from the top of the site. I totally understand that regarding the scope of the fee paid by the Kennedy Trust, that is what the then warden was being told. At that time, I didn't meet any of the regional National Trust staff, and to be fair, I was totally unaware of the management structure. I was an administrator, albeit with a rural heart and heritage, learning about the site itself and what the Kennedy Trustees needed to be aware of. The warden was clearly passing on what he'd been told to say. It's true to say at this point, we both represented charities trying to stretch limited resources, and there was nothing happening in the country more widely that was putting a particular focus on Runnymede. Two things changed that. The Kennedy Trust commemorated the 50th anniversary of President Kennedy's assassination in November 2013, with Ambassador Barzan, amongst others, laying wreaths at the memorial in the presence of distinguished guests and former Kennedy scholars. This received wide national and US coverage. And then, of course, in 2015, the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta was celebrated at Runnymede. Both these events put the whole site on the national agenda, and there were a number of changes in regional National Trust management, probably from around 2010, 2011 onwards, which brought in site management skills, vision, and some design expertise. And crucially, from my perspective, a reassessment of what the annually increasing Kennedy Trust's management fee could actually cover. So we really began to have an opportunity to do some significant work. Jellicoe could have been more helpful to us as we tried to remain faithful to his aims. His kind of let's see how the interaction between people and the natural site impacts on both over the years didn't address specific questions like how much encroaching bramble and rhododendron he might have left, how he might have responded to ongoing health and safety concerns regarding steep steps made, like the pathway itself, of granite setts with increasingly irregular front edges. Sets were often stolen, and a mud chute was created alongside the remedial pebble border that Annabel showed towards the end of her talk, because there remained, and there still remain, those who prefer sliding rather than stepping down the path. There were questions regarding how to manage the understory in the wood, so that we encouraged both bluebells and natural cover, questions about whether and where to coppice, and how to approach the nettles. We were educated by the Guelph lectures on landscape design given by Jellicoe, and also by the complete landscape designs and gardens of Geoffrey Jellicoe by Michael Spence. We also had to try and manage expectations. This was a natural rather than a parkland site. It was approachable from several directions, and it had a public footpath running through it. The National Trust did permit a QR code to be placed on the wicket gateway to the path, linking to an article I wrote explaining something of Jellicoe's thinking behind the various aspects of the memorial. And like Annabel's just said, I wanted, for those who wanted to understand something of the site that they were about to go into, I wanted to give a bit more information than the, by that time, very basic information board, which was all the National Trust were happy to permit adjacent to the gateway. Conversations at the site suggested that American visitors continued to be at best surprised and entranced, and at worst offended. The proximity of the manicured American Bar Association memorial wasn't and isn't necessarily helpful. Ultimately, at this time, we had to trust our instincts, aided by one of the regional National Trust team who had focused on Jellicoe as a student, and hope that we were being faithful to the spirit of the place. There was a line of scrub running up the pathway behind the memorial stone, and this was cleared of brambles, and mixed native flowering shrubs were planted. the understory of the woodland running up the hill was significantly cleared to promote variety and some views into the midst of it. The blackthorns, which had almost enveloped the seats of contemplation, were significantly cut back, and the adjacent area was cleared of scrub and sown with grass, such that wildflowers and the grass would also spread there in continuation of the bigger meadow alongside. By the Magna Carta celebrations, we were working with a warden, now called a ranger, who had landscape management qualifications along with significant vision and skills. He was also great at managing groups of corporate volunteers, such that major clearance, as well as the necessary cosmetic repairs like painting the fence in the ha-ha, were achieved cost effectively and with good relationships, for instance, with the tenant farmer managing the adjoining land. As regards frustrations, keeping the stone itself clean of mold and algae was a perennial problem. It would often look great in October, and by late November, it would look as if no one had given it any thought or care at all. There were, I remember, long discussions about how to clean it and with what materials and when, and just the desire to not to use anything that was too abrasive. But it was very difficult and impossible to preserve the sort of pristine white appearance of it. The magnificent American scarlet oak behind the stone is now very sizable. It drops leaves and rainwater onto the stone itself. The stone is sited at the point where the downward flow of the hillside first levels out. So rainwater, and therefore mud, would always gather in its vicinity. We inserted covered slotted drainage channels up the path, which helped a bit, but they didn't solve the problem. And the entrance to the pathway from the meadow, as referenced, was always muddy. In this, as in other areas, Annabel's research was reassuring regarding Jellicoe's uncertainty as to how to remove this problem. And as Annabel's alluded, the memorial itself was at times focused for anti-US sentiment. Within 1 month of its opening, letters were scratched into the stone. And Annabel's shown graphically what happened in 1968 and in 1974. More recently, in 2003, the top 9 to 10 inches of the memorial stone were smashed with a sledgehammer. This time, the Magna Carta memorial had also been similarly damaged a few days earlier. This particular repair, the 2003 damage, cost about £8,000 and was managed by Clifton Conservation in consultation with the National Trust. Minor frustration for me, but occasionally National Trust personnel would override relatively minor decisions that the warden and I had taken and act more heavy-handedly than either of us wanted. The Kennedy scholarships are called the Living Memorial to the President, and the breadth of Jellicoe's vision surely means that the Runnymede Memorial is so too. I think it's extraordinary that a site so close to the M25 and Heathrow Airport, and with modern levels of traffic on the A308, remains a place of peace and contemplation in all weathers. I visited it in the pouring rain, and I've still found it an extraordinary place in which to journey. I'm grateful for my interaction with it. I hope that we cared for and enhanced the site with a light touch, such that the multi-layered experience Jellicoe was reaching after remains on offer to the visitor. I'm particularly indebted to the 3 wardens with whom I worked, and to Kennedy Trustees Johnny Grimmond and Mary Ann Seacart. As I say, this is a personal reflection. Please receive it as such.
Thank you very, very much, Annie. Helen, are you there? Can I pass over to you?
Thank you, Helen.
With what little time we have left.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just going to pick up the questions in the chat. Oh, sorry. I just, there were two things that came out actually that I'm just going to say what I put in, and then I'll go down through the list. John F. Kennedy is still held in some regard by the general public in the USA and the UK, but historians assessing his legacy as president are much more critical. In the future, could it be that Jellicoe's landscape design with Alan Collins Stone will have a much more meaning as a memorial than the man himself? I don't know whether Annabel could come in on that. Should I ask 2 or 3 questions first and then allow Annabel to finish them? Yeah. Okay. The other question that I asked was really about the kind of decision and the philosophy behind repair rather than a replacement of the stone, leaving a legacy with the stone reflecting its history. And then Helen Neve, do we know if any other sites were considered before Runnymede was unanimously adopted? Would you like to take those, Annabel, now?
Right, okay. I think it's very interesting. I read some research done in the last few years from, I'm sorry, I can't remember the chap's name, but I think it was at Sussex University, and they were saying that they thought that the feeling towards Kennedy at the time of his assassination in the UK was not as strong as obviously the government's thinking was. I'm sorry, I'm not a historian. So and actually the appeal fund fell a long way short. Its target was £1 million, which was a huge sum of money then. And I think it had to be topped up by the government with £500,000 to make about 800,000, I think, roughly. Is that right, Annie? Do you remember?
Yeah, you're right. It was topped up by the government significantly. I think the timing of the election caused major problems, such that ideally the appeal should have been launched the year earlier than it was, and by that time the appeal in a way had missed the wave of public sentiment that might have brought in more money.
Yes, and also Winston Churchill died in that year as well, or the following year, or after the appeal was launched. So that put a cap then on the government money. But so yes, I think I do wonder whether more people know about the memorial than know about the Kennedy Scholars, for example.
Mm-hmm. I think one thing that's worth saying about the scholarship is that one legacy from President Kennedy is the notion of public service, the Peace Corps, enabling young people to sort of push into challenging and to be creative in their response to contemporary challenge. And the public service legacy goes on being a very significant perspective when the trustees come to award scholarships. So, I think if you look at British public servants, key British public servants who've been in receipt of Kennedy scholarships over the 50 plus years, it makes for very interesting reading.
Thank you. I think shall we just go on to Helen's question about other sites being considered before Runnymede was unanimously adopted outside of the area?
No, I mean there were 6 sites were considered, so I think that's enough.
Okay, thank you, Annabel. Yes, a patient shown asking, just reflecting on how Jellicoe, how much he was, how significant his visit to Japan was in the way that he thought about the design of the monument.
I think all his interest in materials and the journey, I think, really was sort of reinforced by that visit. But he talked about Japan in his early responses, in his early writings after the memorial was built, but not in his later ones, which is quite interesting.
it's part of his philosophy, isn't it, really? That the legacy of how Jellicoe thought of the spiritual and how he interpreted design and mythological stories. It's very much part of his what's the word, philosophy, really, about design. Yeah, thank you. Edward Bennis is saying, remarkably, it was ever built considering the politics. It's interesting again also that there's still continuing attacks on the monument, or maybe even on the site. Maybe Anne could answer that one.
Yes, I think 2003, the invasion of Iraq. The site does act as a focus for anti-US sentiment, definitely. And because, as you can imagine, every time there's an incident, there are debates around access, but there is a public footpath running through the site, and there are multiple access points. And I think that everybody associated with the memorial has just felt that to create a kind of cordon around it would be to completely destroy so much that Annabel has talked about as being foundational to the design, even if the legal issues around the footpath and access could be taken care of.
Oh, thank you, that's good. I'm going to just ask one question and I think we'll wind up.
Okay.
And that is about, do you think there's a possibility that there could be a massive campaign to raise funds, to invest more in the way that the management can be, the way that the site can be managed, and in the way that you're talking about the problems you've got with drainage, and a lot of the materials need work and replacements.
Sorry, who are you? Who's that? That's to Annie.
It's just to everybody, really.
Oh, right, okay.
Sorry, I was just thinking off the top of my head, really, but just the fact that there is a lot of problems, and there's an issue about funding and looking after the site in the right sort of way that will keep it moving, keep it protected and looked after for the future.
No, definitely. Definitely.
We'll make you into a landscape manager yet, Helen. I mean, this is the theme tune to my life, yes.
Yeah.
I think some of the problems are like it's a flood meadow at the bottom. So, there's always going to be a problem there, isn't there? I don't know how you resolve that, but I think, squeaky clean ditches maybe would help a bit.
Well, the National Trustees has done very significant work recently, hasn't it, to enable better access, better disabled access, which is again another massive issue.
Yes.
And the drainage issue, certainly when I was retiring, the drainage issue was front and central. And so as I say, I've just retired. I don't know where that's gone, but I know. But you can't negate the fact that it's on a flood meadow, and we've both seen it completely underwater. So
Well, thank you very much for all the. I think I've actually got all the questions. You've had lots. Oh, yes, wonderful depth of research on Zoya, and yes, the fascinating insight to the management of the significant memorial. That's to you, Annie, from Helen. And yes, landscape management as stewardship of a spatial allegory. So there's lots of really, really quite detailed points that really, with people like Annabel and yourself still, actively promoting and thinking about the landscape and Jellicoe's work, is something that really maybe we can help to promote better investment and stronger care. Thank you. I'm going to go back to Helen Mead now. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much, Helen. And I'm going to hand over to Zosha Meller in a moment to formally thank the pair of you for absolutely stunning evening, absolutely fascinating. I almost feel it's a double allegory. The whole thing is a detailed story, and the whole problems and excitement and issues of both designing a landscape and managing it. And I think it's a brilliant case study at a very high level. But thank you very much. Zosha, over to you.
Yes, absolutely, Helen. Thank you so much, Annabel, for that wonderful depth of research. And I feel very privileged to be party to it. So I'm sure all the other attendees will be. And how wonderful to go from the Magna Carta right through the 60s to today. I was struck by your wonderful references to correspondence, and also very interested in the committee, none of whom were designers, but there we go. And it's been a real privilege to take part in this talk. Thank you very much, everybody.